Now let's look at the rest of the MIDI functions, and to show them to you, I've got a MIDI track recorded with a piano on it, and let's just take a listen to it in its default state before we perform any MIDI functions on it. So this is the same one that we used in a previous tutorial, but I've modified it a little bit for our purposes of this tutorial. So what I'm going to show you now are the rest of the MIDI functions. So let's go back to that functions window and choose restrict polyphony. Now, sometimes you'll run into a synthesizer that has a limited amount of polyphony. For example, one of the new Dave Smith instruments that's really cool only has 4 notes of polyphony. Well, this particular track has more polyphony than 4. So if I were to assign this track to one of those 4-note polyphonic synthesizers of Dave Smith's, I could go to restrict polyphony and then tell it to allow how many voices I want. So if I only wanted it to have 4 voices, I can set the voices to 4, click on OK, and now when I listen back to the playback, I'll only hear 4 notes on that track, which means that a 4-voice instrument like the Dave Smith could play this track back. See, some notes are just gone. So that's how you can restrict the polyphony of the playback of a track, and I'm going to undo that quickly because I've got more than 4 notes that I can use. And now let's go back under the MIDI menu and look at our next function, which is thin out data. But to do this, I'm going to open this track a little wider or a little taller by double-clicking on it, and let's look at some of the controller information that's in here. Here's our main volume, and I'm going to type G to zoom out here a bit. Now, I'm going to go back to the MIDI menu and select that thin out data, and what it's going to do is look at the continuous controller information, of which there can be 128 different types of MIDI continuous controllers on a track, all with 128 different values, and that can really clog up your MIDI lines. And a lot of times you can thin the data out without hearing any difference in the playback. So when I click thin out data, you'll notice that the volume just got thinned out. There are fewer commands. Let's go back and do it one more time to thin out that data even more. You'll see that it removed even more. So the thin out command thins out that continuous controller information. And when you're talking about hardware synthesizers, especially older ones that don't have really fast processors, when you thin the data out, it can actually make the track sound better because the processor of the keyboard doesn't have to worry about processing all of that continuous controller information. So it can actually make your track sound better. Now, the next MIDI function has to do with MIDI automation. Now, this track is representative of a performance from a keyboard player that has a volume pedal plugged into the keyboard that he or she is playing, and therefore the main volume, which is continuous controller 7, gets recorded as MIDI data. But now, if you are the engineer and you want full control over the volume automation of the track, but want to use that original performance as a basis, what you can do is come to the original event out here in the project window, and you can go to the MIDI menu, go to Functions, and choose Extract MIDI Automation. And what that's going to do is take the volume and the pan and put it onto the automation lanes, which is a much easier way to edit automation. So I'm going to scroll down, go to my piano track here, then click the Automation Show button right here, and you'll notice that all of that volume information is now on its own automation lane, which makes it easier for you, the engineer, to go through and edit the automation the way that you think is going to sound the best in that particular project. And now to show you the other few MIDI functions, I'm going to scroll back up here, and I'm going to mute that piano track, and let's go to the overlap track here, because I'm going to show you a couple of kind of strange MIDI functions, but I know people that have used them. So let's highlight this bass event, and let's take a listen to it in its original state. Okay, so let's go to the MIDI menu and Functions, and then let's look at Reverse. Now what Reverse is going to do is flip the notes around backwards. They're not going to sound like they're backwards, they're just going to be played in reverse. So when I do that, let's take a listen to the result. Here's originally, and here's in reverse. And similarly, you can also put that information into a mirror and have it play back opposite. So MIDI, functions, and mirror. And now let's listen to the result. So those are a couple of the more avant-garde sorts of MIDI functions. And like I mentioned earlier, there is one more MIDI function that I'm going to cover in section 8. So I'm not going to go over merge tempo from tapping quite yet, because now in the next section I'm going to show you the logical editor.